For 8 years, my house slowly stopped feeling like my own, even though every wall held memories of my past and every corner echoed with the life I had built with my late husband. But everything changed the night my daughter Ariba stood at my doorstep, her eyes swollen with tears, her voice trembling as she begged me to let her stay, and beside her stood Samir, the man she had chosen, the man I barely knew, holding her hand with a confidence that felt rehearsed rather than real, and despite the quiet unease in my heart, I opened the door because that is what mothers do. We choose love over doubt, sacrifice over comfort, and hope over fear. Amy, please, we just need some time, she had whispered, and time was exactly what I gave them, though I never imagined that days would turn into months and months into years, until 8 years of my life had passed in silent compromise. I gave them the master bedroom without hesitation, moving myself into the smaller room at the back of the house, telling myself it was temporary. I took over the cooking, cleaning, and even paying bills whenever Samir claimed he was struggling financially, though I noticed his struggles never stopped him from buying things for himself, expensive gadgets, branded clothes, and nights out that didn't include my daughter, but I stayed quiet because I didn't want to create tension. I didn't want my daughter to feel like she had to choose between her husband and her mother, and slowly, without realizing I began losing her anyway. Samir never called me Amy, not even once. It was always Auntie, spoken politely at first, but over time it became colder, sharper, as if the word itself was a reminder that I did not belong in their world. I noticed the way he would roll his eyes when I spoke, how he would sigh loudly if I reminded him about responsibilities, and how he would complain about privacy in a house that was never his to begin with. And what hurt the most was not his behavior but my daughter's silence, the way she would avoid eye contact when he spoke disrespectfully, the way she stopped defending me, as if keeping peace with him mattered more than protecting me, the woman who had raised her, loved her, and given her everything. But still I endured it all, telling myself that love required patience, that family required sacrifice, that one day things would get better. And for 8 long years I lived like a guest in my own home, until the day everything shifted. It was an ordinary evening when Samir walked in, but the look on his face was anything but ordinary. He was smiling in a way I had never seen before, wide, confident, almost victorious, and Ariba followed behind him, her hands shaking, her eyes filled with disbelief. "We won," he said, his voice steady but filled with excitement, and I remember asking, "Won what?" not understanding how a single word could carry so much weight. And then Ariba spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, "The lottery, Amy. $95 million, and for a moment, everything stood still, the air felt heavier, the room quieter, and then I smiled because what else could I do? I hugged her tightly, telling her how happy I was, how proud I felt, how this was a blessing, and I meant every word because despite everything, she was still my daughter. But as I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Samir watching me, and there was something in his eyes that made my heart sink. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't joy, it wasn't even relief. It was something colder, something calculating, as if he was already thinking ahead, already planning something I couldn't yet see. And in that moment, a quiet realization settled deep inside me. Something had changed, not just in their lives but in mine, because for the first time in 8 years, Samir wasn't looking at me like an inconvenience or a burden. He was looking at me like I was no longer necessary, like I was a problem waiting to be removed. And though I didn't understand it fully at the time, I felt it, a shift so subtle yet so powerful that it made my chest tighten, because somewhere deep down, a voice I had ignored for years finally spoke up, warning me that this sudden fortune wasn't going to bring us closer as a family. It was going to tear us apart, and I didn't know it yet. But that night was the beginning of the end of everything I had sacrificed to protect. Money does not change people as much as it reveals who they truly are, and in our case, the transformation was so fast and so sharp that it left me breathless. Within weeks of winning the lottery, the house I had spent years building with love began to feel like a stranger's place. Expensive furniture replaced the old pieces I had carefully chosen over decades. Walls were repainted without asking me. Decorations I had treasured were quietly removed as if they held no value. And even my kitchen, the heart of my home, was redesigned into something cold and unrecognizable, filled with machines I did not know how to use. And though no one said it out loud, I could feel it in every glance and every silence that I was slowly being erased from the life I had once controlled. Ariba started behaving differently too, her voice softer but distant, her presence no longer warm. "Amy, you should rest more," she would say, but it did not sound like concern. It sounded like a polite way of telling me to stay out of the way, to become invisible in a house that had once revolved around me. And Samir, he changed the most. His struggles disappeared overnight, replaced by arrogance and a sense of superiority that he no longer bothered to hide. He dressed in expensive brands, drove a luxury car, and spoke as if he had always belonged to a world far above mine, often making subtle remarks about standards and modern living that made it clear he saw me as outdated, unnecessary, and beneath him. And yet I stayed silent, holding on to the hope that this phase would pass, that somewhere inside them the people I loved still existed. But that hope began to crumble the evening Samir called me into the living room with an unusual seriousness in his tone. I sat down across from him and noticed how confident he looked, how comfortable he seemed in a space that was never his to begin with. "Auntie, we've been thinking," he said, and that single word, auntie, felt heavier than ever before, like a deliberate reminder that I did not belong. I forced a small smile and nodded, waiting for him to continue. "We're planning to move into a bigger place," he said, "a modern villa with better security, better environment for the kids." And for a moment I felt relieved, thinking that perhaps they were finally ready to build their own life, to stand on their own feet. "That's good," I said gently, "you've worked hard." But the look he gave me made my chest tighten, because there was no gratitude in his expression, only calculation. "Yes," he replied slowly, "and we think it's time everyone had their own space." The words lingered in the air, heavy and unclear, and I felt a strange unease settle inside me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Ariba sat beside him, her eyes lowered, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, refusing to look at me, and in that moment I already knew something was wrong. But I was not prepared for what came next. Samir leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but firm. "We'll arrange a small apartment for you, something comfortable and close by." For a second I thought I had misheard him, my mind struggling to process the words, "a small apartment?" I repeated slowly, and he nodded as if he was offering me a generous gift. "This house is under my name now," he said casually. "We've renovated it, invested in it. It makes sense." My heart dropped so suddenly it felt like the ground beneath me had disappeared. "This house," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm, "was bought by your father before he died." But Samir only shrugged, dismissing my words as if they held no importance. "Things change," he said, and those two words cut deeper than anything else, because they carried no emotion, no respect, no acknowledgement of what this house meant to me. I turned to my daughter, searching her face for some sign of support, some hint that she would speak up, defend me, remind him of the truth. But she remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if avoiding my eyes would somehow make this moment less real. And that was when it truly hit me, not just the betrayal of a man I never fully trusted, but the loss of the daughter I had raised, loved, and protected. Because her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. It told me everything I needed to know, that she had chosen him, chosen this new life, chosen comfort over loyalty. And in that moment I realized that I was no longer part of their future. I was an inconvenience, a burden they were trying to remove. And the home I had once filled with love had become a place where I no longer belonged. That night, sleep never came, no matter how tightly I shut my eyes or how desperately I tried to calm the storm inside my chest, because every corner of the house seemed to whisper memories back to me, reminding me of everything I had given and everything I was about to lose. I sat alone in the living room long after everyone had gone to bed, staring at the walls that once held laughter, at the sofa where I had comforted my daughter through fevers and fears, at the dining table where we had once shared simple meals filled with love. And I could not understand how a place built on sacrifice could suddenly feel so cold and unfamiliar. My thoughts kept circling back to the same painful realization that I was no longer wanted, that after 8 years of giving without question I was now being quietly pushed out like something old and unnecessary. And yet beneath the hurt, beneath the betrayal, something else began to grow. Something I had not felt in a very long time, a quiet strength, a clarity that slowly replaced my confusion, because for the first time I allowed myself to see the truth without excuses. Samir had never respected me, and my daughter had chosen silence over loyalty, and I had allowed it for far too long. The morning came heavy and gray, and with it came the moment that would change everything. Samir called me into the same living room where I had spent the night thinking, and this time there was no pretense of politeness in his tone, only impatience. He held a set of papers in his hand and placed them on the table in front of me as if it were a routine transaction. "I've made it easy," he said, his voice flat and businesslike. "Just sign these. It confirms you'll vacate in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The words echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. 8 years of my life reduced to a deadline, to a simple instruction written on paper. My fingers trembled as I looked down at the documents, the letters blurring for a moment as the weight of the situation pressed down on me. But this time the trembling was not from fear alone. It was from something deeper, something that had finally reached its limit. I lifted my head slowly and looked at him, really looked at him, noticing the arrogance in his posture, the certainty in his eyes, the way he believed he had already won. And then I turned to my daughter, hoping for something, anything, but she stood there silently, her face pale, her eyes avoiding mine, and in that moment something inside me broke. Completely, not with noise or anger, but with a quiet finality, like a door closing for the last time. I gently placed the papers back on the table, my movements calm despite the storm inside me. "I won't sign," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Samir let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if I had said something foolish. "You don't have a choice," he replied confidently, leaning back as though the matter was already settled, and for the first time in years I felt something shift within me, a small spark of control returning. I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips, not out of amusement but out of certainty. "Oh, but I do," I said quietly, and the room fell silent, the confidence on his face flickering for just a second, enough for me to see that he had not expected resistance, that he had grown too comfortable believing I would continue to endure, continue to sacrifice, continue to stay silent. But he did not know everything. He did not know what I had kept safe all these years, what my late husband had ensured before he passed, what I had protected even when I felt powerless, because while I had given them space, comfort, and years of my life, I had never given away what truly mattered, the ownership of this house, the one thing that legally and rightfully belonged to me. And as that realization settled firmly in my mind, the fear that had controlled me for so long began to fade, replaced by a calm determination. I was no longer the helpless mother being pushed out of her own home. I was the rightful owner of everything around me, and for the first time in 8 years I was ready to stop sacrificing and start standing up for myself. Because this was no longer just about a house, it was about dignity, about respect, about reclaiming the part of myself I had slowly lost. And as I sat there facing the man who thought he could erase me, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I was not leaving, not quietly, not unfairly, and certainly not without a fight. 2 days later, everything that had once felt uncertain began to fall into place with a clarity I had not experienced in years. Because instead of sitting in silence and accepting the fate that had been forced upon me, I finally chose to act. I reached out to the one person my late husband had always trusted, a lawyer who had helped us secure this house long before Samir had ever stepped into our lives. And as I sat across from him with trembling hands but a steady heart, I handed over every document I had carefully kept safe all these years, watching as he reviewed each paper with quiet focus. And when he finally looked up at me, his expression was firm, almost reassuring. "This house is entirely yours," he said, each word landing like a weight being lifted from my chest, "not partially, not shared, not disputed, but completely and legally mine." And in that moment something inside me settled. The fear that had haunted me for days disappeared, replaced by a calm strength that I had almost forgotten existed, because the truth was finally on my side. Samir's claims, his confidence, his arrogance, all of it was built on nothing but assumptions. He had never completed any legal transfer, never secured any ownership, and all the money he had spent renovating the house meant nothing without proof. And suddenly the balance of power shifted in a way he could never have anticipated. That evening I called both him and Ariba into the living room, the same room where he had once handed me papers demanding that I leave, and this time I stood there not as someone being dismissed, but as someone who had reclaimed her ground. Samir walked in with visible irritation, clearly expecting another quiet conversation he could control. "What now?" he asked impatiently, and without saying a word I handed him a folder, watching closely as he opened it, his expression slowly changing as he flipped through the documents, confusion turning into disbelief, and disbelief into something closer to panic. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice no longer steady, and I met his gaze without hesitation. "My house," I replied calmly, "legally, completely, undeniably mine." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had felt before. Ariba's face went pale as she realized the truth. Her eyes darting between us as if trying to understand how everything had turned so suddenly. Samir shook his head, his confidence cracking under the weight of reality. "This doesn't mean anything," he said quickly, but even he did not sound convinced, and that was when I spoke the words that had once been used against me. The words that now carried a very different power. "It means you have 2 weeks to leave," I said, my voice steady and unshaken, and for the first time since I had known him, Samir had no immediate response. The same man who had once laughed at my refusal to sign now stood there searching for words that would not come. "You can't do this," he said finally, anger rising in his voice, but I simply looked at him, calm and certain. "I already have," I replied. And in that moment the roles we had played for 8 long years completely reversed. He was no longer in control, no longer the one making decisions, and I was no longer the silent figure in the background. Ariba finally spoke then, her voice shaking with emotion. "Amy, please," and when I looked at her, I saw tears in her eyes, but they did not move me the way they once would have, because love had already cost me too much. It had blinded me, silenced me, and allowed me to be treated as if I did not matter, and I could not let it do that to me again. "You made your choice," I said softly, not with anger but with a quiet finality. "Now live with it," and there was nothing more to say after that. The days that followed were filled with a silence that felt different from before, not heavy with pain but steady with resolution, and exactly 2 weeks later, just as I had once been told, they packed their belongings and left. There were no more arguments, no dramatic confrontations, no apologies, only a quiet understanding that the situation had ended in a way neither of them had expected, and as the door closed behind them, I stood alone in the house that had once felt like it was slipping away from me, but now stood firmly under my control, and though the silence was undeniable, it was no longer lonely, it was peaceful, because I had not just kept my home, I had reclaimed my dignity, my voice, and my worth, and in the end I realized something that no amount of money could ever change. The sweetest revenge is not in hurting those who wronged you, but in standing tall, knowing your value, and never allowing anyone to take it from you again.